psychologists say to sociologists, sociology is just applied psychology. And biologists say, well, that's just applied biology. And the chemists say, well, yeah, that's just applied chemistry. And the physicists say, which is applied physics. Nice to be here on top. And there's the mathematician. Oh, hey, I didn't see all of you over there. I think of mathematics not as directly studying God's creation, but as studying the language with which God wrote creation. And for the most part, I think of math as a language God gave us to understand and describe the intricate workings of his creation. He created us to be inquisitive beings, to want to understand, to want to know. And he created the world according to mathematical rules. Some Christian mathematicians believe that when we're doing mathematics, we're thinking God's thoughts after him. Not God's actual thoughts, of course, but it's fun to consider that as I play with mathematics, I'm using the creative capacity that God gave me, a reflection of the creative aspect of God. I also believe, however, that God gave us mathematics because mathematical understanding and insights can give us insight into the nature of God. What's true in mathematics, particularly related to infinity and dimension, helps me better understand how it is that for God, all things are possible. And I believe that God designed things this way, that he designed us to seek knowledge, that he designed mathematics to help us see through that knowledge not only realities, but also possibilities. Today I'm going to focus on the mathematical concept of dimension and what it might suggest about God. If after today's talk you would like to know more about math and faith interactions, there's a book called Mathematics Through the Eyes of Faith, written by members of the Association of Christians in the Mathematical Sciences. I co-authored a few of the chapters in here, and I'm focusing on chapter 4 today. So let's start with the basics. What do we mean by dimension? Well, sometimes it's described as the number of coordinates needed to specify a point in an object. So let's say your object is a single point. How many coordinates do you need to describe where you are in that object? Well, none. If you're in the object, that's where you are. We know where you are. Zero coordinates are needed. So that's a zero-dimensional object. What if you're on a line segment? Well, I could put a coordinate system on this so that I could know exactly where I am at any given moment. So, for example, I could decide that one side is 0 and the other side is 1. And then if I told you that you're at the point 0.25, you can look at that and you go, oh yeah, I see where I am. It's about there, right? So I just need one coordinate to let you know where I am. That's a one-dimensional object. If I look, though, at, say, a rectangle and its insides, then one coordinate isn't going to do it. So I'm going to put on a two-coordinate system. I'm going to have them both be 0 at the bottom left corner, and one coordinate goes off to the right and one goes up. So now if I tell you, for example, that you're at the point 0.75, 0.25, you can go, okay, I'm 3/4 of the way over, and I'm 1/4 of the way up, and you can figure out where you are. I needed two coordinates. That's two-dimensional. What about a box and its interior? Well, same kind of thing, but now I need 3 coordinates. So I'm going to put 0 up at the top just to freak you out. Also because it didn't show up well if I put it in the back left corner. So it's at the top, and I'm going 1 down, 1 over, and 1 back, okay? So now if I tell you you're at the point 0.75, 0.51, well, I'm 3/4 of the way down the box, I'm half of the way back in the box, and I'm all the way over to the right, and we can see the point there. I needed 3 coordinates. This is a 3-dimensional object. Now, the coordinate stuff might be a little new to you, at least it may have been a few years or decades, but the idea of 1-dimensional, 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional things, we're all good with that, right? 0-dimensional might be a new concept you haven't thought about before. Okay, now we can also think about dimension as the number of mutually perpendicular directions of possible travel within the object. So if I'm at the point, where can I go? Nowhere. It's 0-dimensional. Or on the line segment, where can I go? Well, you might go, hey, there are 2 directions. I can go to the left or right, or I can go to the left. Well, okay, but those aren't perpendicular, right? They're parallel to each other. So there's only one direction of travel, really. What about if I'm in the rectangle and its insides? Well, I could pick a direction, go one way, and I could go perpendicular to that. pretend that's a right angle. But that's it, right? So if I started out a different way, I could go a different way, but it's always just one other perpendicular direction. Yeah, I could go opposite that, but again, that's not a new direction perpendicular to the ones I've already traveled. But if I'm in a box, so I go one way, I could go at right angles to that, or I could go at right angles to that. Okay, so try to picture this, like I'm going to go one way, and then I'm going to go another way, and then I'm going to go at right angles to that. So my fingers are kind of forming those three mutually perpendicular directions, right? So that's a three-dimensional thing. All right, now as a mathematician, I can think about infinite dimensional things. Not great at picturing this, like some people say they can picture the fourth dimension. I can't. I don't have that gift, but I can go 4 and beyond by just taking the coordinates from the first way of looking at it and adding on more coordinates. And so I can see that, that infinite dimensions are possible, even if I can't physically picture what that might look like. Okay. Turns out there are dimensions between whole numbers. So this is really freaky. I'm going to go a little carefully through that. This is something called the Koch snowflake. And it's a curve formed by an iterative process. And by curve in mathematics, I don't necessarily mean that it has to curve around. Okay, so straight line segments can be curves. So I'm going to start with an equilateral triangle. Let's just say every side has length 1. And now I'm going to modify all those sides by taking out the middle third and bumping out a little notch. So I'm going to show you what this looks like. Okay, so here's what I did. I took each side and just bumped out. Okay, so I'm just go back a minute so you can kind of see that happen. Focus in on one of the sides of the triangle and watch it bump out, right? Now, this figure has more little sides. Focus in on one of those, and I'm going to do the same thing. Do you see it bump out? I think I can do it one more time and you can still kind of make it out here. It bumped out again. After this, the figure becomes kind of hard to picture unless we zoom in really far. But the idea is I'm going to keep doing this forever. So I just keep doing this again and again and again and again. And this is a fascinating figure for a lot of reasons. For one thing, it clearly has finite area, right? You can draw a circle around it, find the area of that circle, and whatever the area is inside this curve, it's less than the area of the circle. But the curve turns out to have infinite length. So I started off with a curve of length 3, right? 1, 1, 1. And then I made it 4/3 as big because I took out one third of each piece and then added 2. And so as I keep multiplying by 4/3 again and again and again, the length is going to infinity. So that's kind of cool. But this is even weirder. It turns out the dimension of this thing is about 1.2619. And we're going to get to that. I'll try to show you where that comes from later on, well, as we go. First, what goes into that kind of computation? Well, this is where I might lose some of you, but I promise I'm not going to do tricky, mean math stuff to you. Although I should for Ellie, because she would enjoy it, but it may have been too long. Here's what goes into fractal dimension. Fractions. So if you consider yourself a non-math person that started in elementary school, this was possibly your least favorite part of elementary mathematics. Logarithms, if we lost you in high school, it was probably here. And limits, if we lost you in pre-calculus, it was probably here. But we're not doing super hard stuff with any of this stuff. I do want to talk about logarithms a little bit, though, because that's really important. When we talk dimension, even when you think, length would have units of like feet, right? Area has units of what? Square feet, right? Or feet squared, we'd write it mathematically. Volume has units then, if we're using feet, as cubic feet, right? Or feet cubed. It's the exponent. It's the exponent that tells us what dimension is. So a logarithm is really just it's asking a question. So when I see something like log base 10 of 100, that's asking me what exponent do I need to put on 10 to get 100? Okay, here's a math quiz. What do you think? You don't have to say it, but think about it. What exponent do I have to put on 10 to get 100? 2, right? 2 gives it to me. What exponent do I have to put on 2 to get 8? 3, right. 2 cubed is 8. Okay, trickier one. What do I have to put on 16 to get 4? Well, 4 is the square root of 16, right? And mathematically, we write square roots as an exponent of 1/2. Vaguely remember that from possibly decades ago or just a few years ago or whatever. Okay, so I'm trying to figure out what the exponent is. And what we do is we count boxes. So I'm going to try just thinking about a segment of length 1. We know that's one-dimensional, so we're expecting one dimension to come out of this. But let's just see. So I'm going to try to fit it into a grid of 1 boxes. Now I know what you're thinking. Those do not look like boxes. This is true. When you hear the word box, you picture what I would call a 3-box, a 3-dimensional box like what you get your stuff from in Amazon, unless it's been bashed in by the mailing process and doesn't quite look like a box anymore. But a square would be, or a rectangle would be a 2-dimensional box. A little line segment would be a 1-dimensional box. So I'm going to call these 1 boxes. And what I'm imagining is taking this grid, this 1-dimensional grid, and breaking each unit up into n little boxes. Okay. I'm using 4 just because that's easier for us to picture. So these are boxes of length 1/4, okay, each of those things. But I'll use n to think about letting that get bigger and bigger and bigger, which means the little boxes get smaller and smaller. So how do I fit this thing in? Well, if I put the segment in exactly right, it covers exactly n of those little segments. Right? I could shift it a little bit and pick up 1 more, so I have n plus 1. But basically, it's still just n, and here's what I mean by that. Right now, between 4 and 5, that's a fairly substantial difference. But when n is like 500 million, you know, if you're going to give me $500 million, I don't really care if you give me $1 more on top of that. I'm not going to argue for that, right? It's not much of a difference. So basically, it takes about n 1 boxes to make this work. Now notice the exponent on the n. It's 1, right? That's what we're getting at for dimension. What if we tried to put this thing that we know it's 1-dimensional, but say we didn't know, try to put it into a grid of 2 boxes, right? So the little squares have sides 1/n. Well, I could put it in exactly right and cover exactly n of them. In this case, 4, n is 4 for us. Or I could shift it a little, and now I've got 5 of them, n plus 1 of them. But I can angle it in this thing, right? I'm not restricted to a flat line. And if I angle it, what happens? Well, kind of worst case scenario, I could go n over and n down. But of course, with the angle, I'd lose some of those. But worst case scenario, about 2n boxes that I contact in some way. Again, notice that the exponent is 1. You might go, yeah, but you're multiplying by 2. Well, for one thing, logarithms sort of shunt that off to the side, particularly when we go to limits. So I'm not going to get into the details of that. But also, again, when n is like 200 million, the n totally wins over the 2 there. What if I were trying to put this line segment of length 1 into a 3x3, a 3-dimensional grid? So I put one of the 3 boxes in blue just to make it stand out a little more. And I'm not going to try to draw my segment in there, but you can picture the same kind of thing, right? If it's in exactly right, it's going to cover or contact exactly n of those boxes, of those little cubes. If I shift it over a little, I might get n plus 1 of them. If I angle it, and now I can angle a couple different ways, right? I could get more. But worst case scenario, n over, n down, n back. So about 3n. But in all these cases, we had that n there. And n we can write as n to the 1. That's the same mathematically. So the exponent I'm getting is 1. All right, let's make it trickier. What if I try to take a square and its interior? So yeah, I know we all know that's 2-dimensional. Let's see what happens if we do this process. Well, first of all, we can't even use 1 boxes at all, right? Because no 1 box, if you start putting it in, the 1 boxes are always there's going to be part of the square that's outside the 1 boxes. There's no way to get that. So we just move right away into 2 boxes. So the 2 boxes is a square, side 1/n. And if I put this exactly in right, there'd be n squared of them that it hits. If I shift it around a little bit, I could get a few more, but no more than like 2n squared. So that's kind of my limiting factor there. If I try to put that square into a grid of 3 boxes, turns out the max number I could hit is like 3n squared. Again, the exponent in both cases is n squared, right? It's 2-dimensional. So the exponent on the n is 2. Let's go back to the snowflake. And I'm just thinking about the boundary of it, not the inside. Okay? What is the dimension of that? Well, 1 boxes are not going to work. Remember this process where we always took little segments, cut out the middle third, and added this little bump? So there's no way that any 1 segment is going to contain this without part of it jutting out. So we move right on to a 2 and a 2 by 2 grid, a grid of 2 boxes. And if you count these, and here's what I mean, like doesn't intersect this box, but it hits this one. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, not this, 8. You get what I'm doing? Okay. So it turns out that I hit 16 of those boxes. Now n was 4 here. Here I'm going to pay attention to the n because I want to give you a little bit of the limit idea. When n is 4, I hit 16 boxes. 4 squared is 16. Okay, but let's do a finer grid. So I'm going to let n be 8, which means my little squares are 1/8 by 1/8. And I'm going to count boxes the same way. And this time I get 44 boxes. That is not 8 squared. It turns out it's 8 to the approximately 1.8. So the exponent went down a little bit when I used a finer grid. I'm going to do it one more time, and then it gets beyond my ability to draw it well on here. Let's use n equals 16. Then when I count all the boxes that the curve contacts in some way, I got 88. That is not 16 squared either. That's 16 to about 1.6. And as I let n get bigger and bigger and bigger, what happens is that exponent starts approaching 1.2619 and so on. So that's why we say the fractal dimension of the Koch snowflake is 1.2619, rounding a little bit. Does that kind of make sense? Okay, by we I just mean all mathematicians. Some mathematician somewhere has applied this process to various other things. Lots of mathematicians have done this kind of zooming in more and more and counting. So the boundary of Wyoming, right, best state to get if you have to design one state piece of a 5th grade, map of the United States, because it's essentially a rectangle, except a tiny little bit up there at the left corner. That's the Yellowstone River, I think. But anyway, this turns out to be one-dimensional. Great, rectangle, we hope that. South Africa's coastline, a little more interesting stuff to it, 1.02 dimensional. Britain, or as I like to think of it now, the Easter Bunny, 1.25 dimensional. It's a bit more craggy, right? So we get something more like the Koch snowflake thing going on. The surface of a head of broccoli. Now, I don't mean the volume of the broccoli. I mean thinking of the surface of each little tiny broccoli leaf. All that stuff, that's more than 2-dimensional. The surface of a sphere is 2-dimensional, right, if you're not including the inside. So broccoli head, pretty well packed in there. The human brain, 2.79 dimensional. Now, I've lost where I am in my notes. Let me see if I can find this, because this is kind of cool. It turns out that research shows us that fractal dimension of the brain increases as we age until it starts to decrease at some point. I'm not sure where I am in that path. You can all guess where you are. Fractal dimension of the gray matter in the brain increases in Alzheimer's. No, decreases in Alzheimer's, but increases in MS patients. I haven't read into why. That's kind of interesting. Fractal dimension of the white matter decreases in ALS and MS patients. What about lungs? It turns out, again, just the surface of all those little pathways, all those little air sacs and stuff, almost 3-dimensional, even though those surfaces, if you just look at one, is a 2-dimensional thing, but packed all together like that, almost 3-dimensional. Someone with diseased lungs? No, not that high. Their lungs are not as efficient as someone with healthy lungs. So a lot of cool stuff that way. All right, C.S. Lewis says that one of the difficulties with, well, no, actually, I wanted to say that first. Let's see what I want. I'll just say this myself. I'm going to say one of the difficulties with thinking about higher dimensions is that we lose sight of it, right? I can think 1-dimensionally. I can think 2-dimensionally. I can think 3-dimensionally. Beyond that, my normal human experience doesn't really cut it. We're going to approach higher dimensions by way of analogy and help you see how creatures in a lower dimensional world might approach us. I'm just going to go through this quickly. Yeah, in the interest of time. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about a 2-dimensional world called Flatland. Some of you may have heard me talk about this before. Now it's flatter. Okay, so here's Flatland. And the creatures in Flatland are geometric figures. This book, by the way, was written in 1903 by a man named Edwin Abbott. I don't know why his middle name is the same as his last. Something wrong with his parents, but you know, personally I think parents should probably be locked up for a month or so before they name a child, but that's what he got. Okay, so now this is what we see of flatlanders, right? This is not what flatlanders see. What do flatlanders see? Well, they're living in that plane. This is what they see, right? So how do you know who you're talking to? Well, you have to learn how to judge. How many sides does the shape have by what you can see? Maybe you can see an angle and you can see the line segments kind of receding into the background. That's what the world is like to them. Here's another question for you. What would flatlanders say is his boundary? So that pentagon up there at the top, in case you've forgotten pentagon. What would he say is his skin? It's the line segments that make up the pentagon, right? We are looking inside the pentagon. We are seeing like he's flayed open for, you know, an autopsy or something. That's what we're seeing. No one else sees that. If a surgeon wants to operate on the pentagon, the surgeon has to cut through the pentagon skin somehow, which are those segments, right? Are you clear that those are real firm boundaries for the pentagon? Someone in the pentagon's world has to break through that in order to get to the interior of the pentagon's body. We don't have to, right? We're out here in the third dimension. We can see right inside there. We could reach right inside there and touch something. We could talk to the pentagon in a weird way. By the way, I am speaking about the men in Flatland. The women are literally one-dimensional characters, or as I like to think of them, assassins. Okay, so the main character in our story is a square. And one day the square sees, well, actually he has a dream. And in his dream he's approaching a place called Lineland. And the characters in Lineland are line segments. Okay, well, the men. The women are zero-dimensional characters here. Does that bother me? No, not at all. But it's actually partly written, the book was written partly as a critique on Victorian society and that women were always seen as less than men. Anyway, the square recognizes the longest line segment, says that must be the king. I'm going to start talking to the king. So the square kind of moves over close, starts talking to the king. Now what does the king feel? Well, there's this voice, like coming through his ears, but also echoing around in his body, like someone driving by with a ramped up bass, right? It's got boom, 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 you feel it in your heart. What is the king thinking? Am I going crazy? Is this a god? Where is this coming from? And the square's like, I'm not a god, I'm just out here in the second dimension. The king's like, what are you talking about? And the square moves over, puts his mouth in Lineland so that they can have a more normal conversation. And he's telling the line segment, look, you need to step up off your dimension. There's a whole second dimension to the world that you're missing. And the line segment's like, up? You mean north? The square's like, no, up into the second dimension. Eventually he gets tired and, okay, that was a dream. He wakes up. And sometime later, a similar experience happens to the square, where he feels this voice like echoing around in his body. Well, it turns out it's a sphere up in Spaceland talking to the square. And the square can hear the voice everywhere, and the square's thinking the same kind of stuff. Is this a god? Am I going crazy? The sphere does the same thing, comes down, enters into Flatland, and what does the square see? Well, a point, right, where the sphere is just tangent on Flatland for a moment. And then the sphere starts pushing his way in, and that point grows, but it still does not look like a sphere, right, not to the Flatlander. And so they have the same exact conversation. You're just thinking that's the whole world. That's just a slice of the world. Just step up. And the square's like, up? You mean north? No, up into the third. Well, the sphere comes over and grabs the square and actually drags him up into Spaceland. So now he can see his world as a slice of this three-dimensional world. And he thinks this is amazing, right? And the first thing he asks, well, one of the first things is, wow, this is so cool. What is the fourth dimension like? And the sphere is like, what? No, there's no fourth dimension. There's only three dimensions to the world. So interesting. The square, having had his perspective so dramatically changed, can now anticipate that there's more. The sphere is still trapped in his finite dimensional view of things. Okay, a little diversion. I'm just going to have a figure pass through Flatland. You tell me what you think it is. I don't know if you can tell there's some red and some black edges going on there. Okay, in the interest of time, we're just going to go on. Turns out it's a box, kind of an angle passing through. Now, that might have been hard enough for us to think about. We saw the view from the third dimension. What does a flatlander see? Well, the flatlander sees it like this, and there it is, and it turns red, and then it disappears. Is there any way the flatlander is going to figure out that that was a box? They have no perception of this. C.S. Lewis actually says, look, a flatlander, if you try to explain a cube to a flatlander, the flatlander's either going to see 6 squares set out side by side and lose the unity, or they're going to picture 6 squares all stacked on top of each, smashed together, superimposed, and lose the individuality. And Lewis suggests our problems are much the same with thinking about the Trinity. Okay, so flatlanders, it's different if you're looking at a flatlander from within flatland or outside. The boundaries are different. When someone talks to a flatlander from outside flatland versus inside, the talk is different. The way they perceive it is different. Could you, from the third dimension, actually reach in and hold together a broken bone inside a flatlander's body without them seeing you? Absolutely, because you can reach in from the interior and not have to break through the skin. Right? This changed the way I thought about the possibilities of faith healing, honestly, to start thinking about this way. Because God can't possibly be trapped in our three-dimensional existence. God's existence, whatever it is, has got to be outside of our 3 dimensions. What God sees when he looks at us is not what we see when we look at each other. When we hear God's voice, how do we perceive that? Not necessarily through our ears. When we feel God's touch, how do we perceive that? Not necessarily in the same kind of way. Are we really a single peoplehood? When I look out, I see a bunch of individuals, each approaching life in their own way, but maybe we really are connected in a dimension that we just can't even see. If I were to reach into flatland, the flatlander would first think these arcs were 5 completely disconnected things and would not at all know that there's a whole body connecting them together out here. Could that really be going on? Ephesians 4 says, there is one body and one spirit, just as you were called to one hope when you were called. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all, and in all, and through all. Maybe those aren't just words. Thank you.